Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining Humentum's webinar on breaking the starvation cycle, our administrative cost recovery report results conversation with Humentum, the Ford Foundation, and Twaweza. We are very excited to host this conversation and are grateful for our sponsor of all of our Wednesday webinars, Western Union Business Solutions. We also give a huge round of thanks to our industry partners who you can see here that support our work and all of our members and the community. I am going to go over a few housekeeping notes as you all join to just let you know how things will run and then hand it over to our panel. So first, we are recording this session and you will receive access to the recording in a follow-up email. You will not receive that follow-up email today, so don't worry if you don't see anything in your inbox, but it will come this week and you will receive the recording as well as some additional follow-up items. Additionally, we are providing subtitles. So if you see at the bottom of your screen, of your Zoom screen, it may say subtitles, it may say live transcript. You can turn that on or off by clicking show or hide based on your preference. So if you find it distracting, you can turn it off. If it's helpful, you can turn it on. And captions will also be available in the recording. We will be continuing the discussion with questions from all of you attendees. So please feel free to put comments in the chat as we go through. Our moderator, Dr. Christine So, our CEO at Humentum, will be keeping an eye on the chat as well and pulling things into the conversation. So we do ask that everyone remain muted throughout the panel. We have a lot of you joining, which is very exciting, but that does mean it is hard to keep track of everyone who's unmuted. And so using the chat is going to be the best way to get your comments or questions included in the discussion. With that, I am very, very excited to hand it over to Dr. So and have her introduce everyone on the panel.
Great, thank you, Jessica. Jessica, can you give me a thumbs up that you can hear me fine? Great. So good day, everyone. Really pleased to see you all here. We are excited about today's conversation. As Jessica said, the strength of the numbers in registration really reflects how important this topic is. And I think that one of the things that I want to underscore for our approach to this research, what we will be talking about today and how Humentum thinks about change is really that we want to be generating evidence, identifying insight and takeaways, but then really focus on what are the practical applications of what we learn so that we can move towards change and transformation across the sector. And so to get us started, I will just give you a bit of context around how Humentum is approaching financial sustainability, administrative cost research and coverage, which is that we have a theory of change that looks at the creation of locally led and equitable development and really thinks that we need to have autonomy. Organizations need to have autonomy over their institutional architecture, their finances and funding, their people and culture, and their risk and compliance in order to be able to be fully work at their full capacity and to be full actors within the global development sector. And so today's work really gets at that piece around funding and financial systems and financial sustainability. But as we will see, as you have seen in the research and as we will discuss today, we also know that financial sustainability and financial health of organizations has a spillover effect on all of the critical functions of an organization. And that without financial health and financial sustainability, an organization cannot work at its full potential. So I am very pleased to be joined here today by our panelists. We have Aiden Ayakuze, who is the CEO of Twaweza. Twaweza is based in Tanzania, but has extended its work to several other countries. Kathy Reich, who is the Director of Building Institutions and Networks at the Ford Foundation. Tim Boyes-Watson, who is with us as the Global Director of Influence and Initiatives at Humentum. And Siem Bortkosh, who is one of Humentum's associate consultants and is a key contributor to this work. So I am going to launch us into the discussion of the work and want to ask each panelist to provide some initial feedback on their thoughts. I will start with a kick-off question to them. But as you all will see, and probably any of you who has been in a previous webinar that I have moderated, we like to have a conversation style moderation. I invite our panelists to jump in if they have comments or thoughts about what anyone else is saying. And importantly, we will be monitoring the chat throughout the webinar. And so as we go, if you have comments or questions about what you are hearing from the panelists, I invite you to put those comments and questions in the chat as they come up, because we will try to grab them from the chat and integrate them into our discussion, rather than waiting till the very end and having a dedicated Q&A session. So we will have time for questions at the end, but again, I encourage you to put your questions and comments in the chat as we go, and we will try and bring them into the discussion. So with that, I want to again thank all of you for being here. I want to welcome our panelists. And I am going to start off with asking Aiden to get us going with the first question, which is, from your institutional and professional perspective, what did you find as the most important findings of the research and why? What were your big takeaways from the research?
Thank you very much, Christine, and thank you to the panelists and to Humentum especially for inviting us to be part of this study and to join this webinar. Greetings from sunny Dar es Salaam. So I think if I was to hone in on really one finding that I've been reading here that is important, and it seems obvious, it's just how few of my peer organizations, grantees, have in terms of unrestricted reserves, how so many organizations operate literally on the edge of their financial resource envelope. And if anything happens that is unexpected, then they're in crisis mode almost immediately with no time really to think about how to resolve it. And they're running from pillar to post just to make ends meet and keep the lights on, this kind of thing. I mean, the finding here explicitly is finding number 2 in the executive summary, which says only 50% had unrestricted reserves equivalent to about 21 days or less of annual expenditure, which means I think the other, if I understand it, perhaps Tim can correct me, is that most of the others don't have any restricted reserves at all, right? So we are lucky as Twaweza that we have been able to build up a reserve. It's not massive, but I can tell you, transparency, it's about $550,000 that we have stashed away somewhere, built up over the years in order for us to be able to meet those moments where cash is tight for whatever reason. COVID, a donor is delayed, an unexpected opportunity comes up and we want to take advantage of it. Now, let me tell you, as the head of an organization like that, it certainly helps me sleep a little more soundly at night, you know, to know that we have that kind of buffer in case things don't go according to plan. So it is critical. Now, we have built this, and in fact, we had a couple of conversations because we have 2 sets of donors who fund Twaweza in a basket funding kind of way. We have bilateral government donors, and we had at 1.5, but a number are now cycling out, and we have a number of philanthropic, sort of private foundation philanthropic donors, such as Ford Foundation, here represented by Kathy, I think. So the bilateral government donors don't want to hear anything about a reserve. They say, you're gonna have a reserve, okay, don't use our money in that. Whereas the foundation donors, I remember having a conversation this 2 or 3 years ago, said, what do you mean you don't have a reserve? You have to have a reserve policy in your budget. So here we are with these two sets, completely different perspectives on the funding. And luckily, our mix allows us to then set aside a portion. It's a modest portion every year of sort of foundation money to a reserve fund that we are building up beyond $550,000 at the moment. So this debate and discussion that we're having with funders, for me, is just so indicative of the very different perspectives that funders have of the grantees, and the very different perspectives of what financial health and financial sustainability and resilience is, depending on who you're talking to. I think, but the other thing is that sort of comes out at me from this is on the side of the grantees, the recipients, the partners, whichever word we choose, we have tended to be really quite timid about asking for this kind of support, for the kind of funding that will make us more resilient. We have tended to be much more willing to accept the conditionalities that come almost automatically and sometimes boilerplate to us, to accept that this is just the way it is and there's nothing we can do about changing it because it'll take too much effort, it has to go to headquarters, etc. And we've had a chance to be able to say, yes, please do take it to headquarters, actually, because this is relevant for us to become in the work that we do. If we're interested, if you're interested in our mission, and we'll come to this a little bit later, of maybe systems change, really serious social transformation change, we have to be able to see it through over the long term. We have to be able to have some flexibility in how we respond to opportunities or threats. And that means, therefore, that you have to also rethink your partnership with us in terms of the funding in order for us to be able to achieve our mutually agreed objectives. But if we are shackled and handcuffed, it is so much harder to achieve the bigger goals that you and us are both interested in. So please do really think about it. Think about how much you want to control. Think about how much you want to have a say over the things that we do, whether it's procurement or budgeting or variance when reporting on how we've used the resources. Be just aware that that can shackle us, it can slow us down, and it just leads to a number of missed opportunities in terms of arriving at the things that. So this, for me, this unrestricted reserve piece, which is separate from core funding, which is another element. But this unrestricted reserve piece, I think, is so vital for organizations to be able to have and to build in order for them to be really effective at doing their big, hairy, audacious goals type of work. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Aidan. And I see some questions already appearing in the chat, but I'm going to come back to those because I want to give people a chance to get us really going in the context. So I'm going to switch over to Kathy and ask you, Kathy, what were your big takeaways? And I also invite you, Aidan did talk about that difference and tension between philanthropic approach to allowing for unrestricted reserves or even encouraging that versus what we're seeing from some bilateral donors. So if you want to comment on that as well, that would be great. Over to you, Kathy.
Great, thanks, Christine. And it's a real honor and a joy for me to be on this panel today, especially to be on with Aidan, because some of what I will talk about, his organization, Twaweza, has directly influenced and is hopefully benefiting from. So, so to go to the Humentum report, I think that most striking for me in the report is the extent of this problem of chronic underfunding of NGOs' indirect costs, and how remarkably consistent this problem is all over the world. Humentum's finding that more than 60% of all project grant agreements don't cover the full cost is rather stunning, because it means that going in, funders know that they're shortchanging their grantee partners, right? They know it. And so we're expecting NGOs to achieve ambitious outcomes and deliverables while deliberately underfunding them to do so. And this type of funder behavior is actually causing real harm in communities, because it is keeping civil society organizations smaller and weaker than they need to be in order to achieve the kind of large scale systemic social change that Aidan is talking about. And it's also striking to me that Humentum found that full cost funding alone is necessary, but it is not sufficient to ensuring NGO financial sustainability. NGOs also need help, as Aidan just spoke so eloquently about, in building their organizational reserves, and they need help in improving their financial management and their cost recovery practices. They need help in not being timid and in really asking funders for what they need. And I really shouldn't find any of that too surprising for a couple of reasons. First, the number of full cost funders out there is still very much in the minority. It means that those who are paying full costs are essentially subsidizing the funders who aren't. And even then, we can't fill that gap. And I, by the way, have this discussion with bilateral donors all the time. I basically say to them, we are subsidizing your work because we will cover overheads at the Ford Foundation. That doesn't seem to be a very compelling argument for them in terms of changing their minds, but it is an argument that I continue to make. And then I think it's important to realize that NGOs also are suffering from years and sometimes decades of systemic underinvestment. NGOs have been malnourished. And as we all know, when you are working with someone who has been malnourished, simply paying the full cost, simply giving them a square meal is not going to bring them back to health overnight, nor will it make up for the starvation of the past. So at the Ford Foundation, we have come to recognize our role in perpetuating this nonprofit starvation cycle. And we decided that we did want to have a different kind of relationship with our grantee partners. In 2016, we announced a series of steps to try to break that cycle in our own grant making. So the first thing we did was commit to dramatically expanding our provision of unrestricted support. In 2015, 36% of Ford's grant making came in the form of general or core support, essentially unrestricted support. In 2021, that percentage was 81% of our grant making. The second thing we did was we committed to pay a minimum 20% indirect cost rate on all of the project grants that we do make. And we will pay higher rates if our partners can document that they have a higher IDC rate. And the third thing we did was we launched the program that I direct, Build, which gives 5-year commitments to key partners of the foundation. I'm really honored to say that Twaweza is a Build grantee partner. I know that there are a few more of you on the call as well. I saw someone from Akilidada on the call, for example. A majority of each Build grant does come in the form of unrestricted support, and the rest, on average, about 35% of the total funding commitment, is what we call core support for institutional strengthening. So each Build organization uses that money to invest in their own long-term resilience, whether that is investing in strategy, in talent, or in financial sustainability. And really important is we don't tell the partners what to spend that money on. They tell us what they plan to spend it on. A significant number of Build grantees do choose to place at least some of their Build funding in operating reserves. And as we're going forward in the program, we really are encouraging our grantee partners to think about that and to seriously look at putting some of their Build money into reserves, especially if those reserves are non-existent or are underfunded, right? We like to see NGOs with at least 3 months cash operating reserve, and Most NGOs that we work with don't have anything close to that. So an independent evaluation of the BUILD program does show that this type of long-term, flexible, and supportive funding generates results. BUILD organizations are better able to plan and execute on their missions than before they received our support. They are more financially sustainable. They are more successful in leveraging support from other donors, and they are better able to compensate and support their staff. And as a result, the evaluation reports that BUILD has contributed to increases in social impact. Look, we clearly have a lot more to do at the Ford Foundation. I do not want to hold us up as a paragon of virtue. For example, the Humentum research indicates that our 20% floor on IDC rates may indeed be too low. But I still think that Ford's example is a powerful one because it indicates that even a large institutional funder can change course, can do it relatively quickly, and can do it with concrete and positive results for the NGOs with which we partner. So for funders who are thinking it is time for you to change course, I encourage you to visit a new website that just went live yesterday, the Funding for Real Change website. It is hosted by Edge Funders and the Ariadne Network, and it's packed with useful tools and resources about how you can move to full cost funding and hopefully from there to fully unrestricted funding. So I will drop that link into the chat and I will turn things back to you, Christine.
Great, thank you, Kathy. I think that it's great that you were able to address the findings, tell us more about what Ford is doing, and acknowledge that we all still have a lot of work to do to get to the point where we're even close to thinking about equitable development and equitable support to implementing partners. I think we're hearing about this issue of unrestricted reserves, and I do just want to note that the problem with the difficulty of building unrestricted reserves exists for local and national implementing partners, NGOs. It also, surprisingly, I know I'm always a bit taken aback by this, exists for a lot of the very large organizations because they tend to have cost reimbursable grants that don't actually allow them either to build up reserves. And so I do want to just note that this is an issue that goes across the sector and is true for many organizations. And the issues that we're discussing around local and national organizations, it has the same knock-on effect in some ways for those international organizations as well. With that, I want to switch over and ask Siem to join us. And Siem, tell us about what you took away from the research, but as somebody who was involved in doing the research, what were some of the surprises for you, maybe the things that you didn't expect, and how do they have a real impact on where we go with this as we go forward?
Thanks very much, Christine, and thank you everybody for joining. It's really great to be here. Just to say, I was incredibly lucky and privileged enough to be the project lead on the research and a co-author of the report. And as someone who has been a finance director in the NGO sector for many years, and someone who's advised many NGOs on financial strategy and cost recovery, I wasn't particularly surprised by quite a lot of what I saw in the research. The difficulties that the NGOs in our study were experiencing just felt very much like the lived reality for almost all NGOs in the current funding context. But I really want to echo what Aidan said about the average levels of unrestricted reserves. I did find that very surprising. So on average, the unrestricted reserves held by the grantees in our study were less than half the grantees had less than 21 days of their annual total expenditure. That's just 3 weeks of unrestricted reserves to tide them over in case there's some sort of a problem or some unforeseen adverse event. And I did find that very, very striking. We looked at the reserves in the research as part of a a review really of the financial health of the organizations that participated in the study. And we did a financial health assessment quite systematically of those organizations. And sort of building on that point around the 21 days of unrestricted reserves, we found that 2/3 of the organizations in the study had financial health that we would say was, either low or medium or medium low, taking a look at both their unrestricted reserves and their total reserves coverage and the diversity of their funding. And what was interesting to me about that, and I guess also very concerning, was that we found in the detailed discussions that we had with those organizations in the research that they in general had quite low expectations. They just didn't think that things could necessarily be any different or any better. They were very long experience and hard work in trying to cover their costs had, I guess, taught them that they couldn't really expect much better, that funders wouldn't do much better, and that you couldn't actually build up your reserves. And this was, I guess, the nature of being an NGO. And our views on what constituted a good level of reserves were sort of different from their views of what constituted good levels of reserves. So there is something there that speaks to the point that Aidan was making about expectations, about being more demanding, about working with funders so that there are different possibilities. As part of the assessment of the organizations in the research, we also looked at factors that might influence the financial health of those organizations. And we looked specifically at one set of factors which were around, for lack of a better term, income quality, like how good is the income that this organization has, thinking about both unrestricted funds, but also grants that make a full contribution to the administration costs of the organization. And then the other factor that we looked at was the quality, if you like, of the cost recovery practice of those organizations. Do they have the processes and the systems and the management intent to make sure that they are covering their costs from donors? And then we tried to triangulate those factors with the financial health of the different organizations. And we came up with some quite interesting findings, a couple of which were really quite surprising. It wasn't surprising to us that organizations, there was a certain correlation between financial health and good income quality. Basically having a certain amount of unrestricted funds and having donors that were prepared to contribute a full and fair share of administration costs did contribute to having reasonable financial health. And that's the reason why we've made some recommendations to funders that they should not only consistently provide full cost recovery for admin costs, but they should also provide a portion of unrestricted funding to help build up reserves. But what was more surprising, if you like, was that we found that having good income quality wasn't enough on its own. It was a necessary factor for good financial health, but it wasn't a sufficient factor for good financial health. And what we discovered, and what was really striking to me, and I really remember the moment I realized this when I was studying the data, was the fact that the organizations that had both good income quality and good cost recovery practice and combined those two things were much, much more likely to have good financial health. And that correlation between income quality and cost recovery practice seems to be, the research seems to be saying this is a really important driver to having good financial health and therefore good sustainability in your organization. And that sort of really speaks, I guess, to the point that Kathy was making about the fact that funders can be very enlightened, very generous. They can give general operating support. They can give significant amounts towards administration cost, but the organization needs to be able to secure that through good cost recovery practice from a number of different funders for it to have the impact that that is intended. So that's why we felt, and we made some recommendations in the report, that funders need to provide investment, I guess, to their grantees to help them strengthen their capabilities in cost recovery practice. Everyone needs to be good at this. It's a core skill, and organizations need to be able to do it, and funders need to support organizations to develop that skill set, so that each NGO can be in a position both to have good income quality and also good cost recovery practice, and therefore bottom line financial health that makes that organization sustainable for the future.
Thank you, Siam. Yeah, really important to hear from you about the work that how you actually did the work, what you found from that. And I think we hear you underscoring points that Kathy and Aidan made also about this idea that unrestricted reserves and cost recovery do not necessarily equate financial health and sustainability. There are additional components to that that need to be supported and prioritized in order to really create a holistic approach to financial health and sustainability within an organization, and that donors, funders have different ways that they can support that. And it doesn't necessarily only mean allowing an organization to have money going into unrestricted reserves. It also means support of building capabilities within an organization, and having a standard way of approaching risk. Kathy, you mentioned trust-based giving, and I think that, or grant making, and I think that's a very important concept, and certainly one that we at Humentum are looking at in our compliance and risk component of our work, and how risk is allocated across funding relationships and across partnerships to actually implement work, who holds the authority and the accountability for risk and compliance, and how the risk and compliance framework and mitigation is put together in the tensions between co-creating that or the imposition of a risk framework on an implementing partner or grantee. So again, really important concepts. With that, let me go to Tim. And Tim, you were the lead from the Humentum side on this work. And why don't I just invite you to build on what our other panelists have already been telling us.
Great, thanks, Christine. And I think the panelists have already shared quite a few of the major findings. So I wanted to turn to, why is it that these kind of misplaced expectations are still so powerful? The misplaced expectation that overheads or administration costs should be low, the misplaced expectation that reserves should be low for nonprofits. These are what are driving the nonprofit starvation cycle, if you like. And yet the evidence suggests that they don't lead to the outcomes that funders should want. In fact, keeping overheads low and reserves low is not a sign of efficiency at all. What's clear is it's a sign of risk. And one of the things we found in our research is that the systemic underfunding of organizations means that 2/3 of them had a real problem recruiting and retaining staff. And that really key organizational functions are significantly under-resourced. The most under-resourced one the grantees told us about was actually safeguarding or preventing sexual exploitation of their employees in the communities they work with. So this, rather than this kind of mitigating risk or anything, it's actually creating risk. And this can't be in funders' interests, it's not in the NGOs' interest, and it's certainly not in the communities and the people affected by crises' interests. So there's something so persistent about these myths that is, if you like, driving a dysfunction at the heart of the funding system. And I think you've heard what's interesting about the research, and you've heard from two examples here of extraordinary examples. So AIDEN and Twaweza are not a typical NGO. They've done brilliantly at securing those reserves that you talked about. Most of the NGOs in our study, well, 2/3 of them had low financial health. And Kathy, as a funder, Ford is doing great work, but you're not representative of the funding community at large. And this is what we have to shift. So I think, for me, obviously the purpose of the research is to learn, right? To create knowledge, but then knowledge which then drives change. And I think the funders for real cost and real change that Kathy mentioned, is an example of a movement that's building amongst funders to take evidence and to convince other funders to change their practices. I think this research and the evidence is also powerful for NGOs. A group that we haven't talked about are INGOs. So INGOs are often in the middle of this relationship between funders and their national NGO partners. And our research found that they too are probably part of the problem more often than they're part of the solution. They're not providing full cost coverage, and they may also, of course, be being squeezed themselves by the funding arrangements they have with their funders. So I think what's clear is that individually you can take action around this, both as a funder to change your practices or as an NGO to improve your cost recovery, to improve your income quality by diversifying your funding, seeking different forms of funding. But there also needs to be systemic change around these issues, which can only be achieved if we start taking collective action. And we probably build alliances between funders, international NGOs, and national NGOs to make that systemic change. So back to you, Christine.
Okay, thank you, Tim. So this first bit of the discussion has been great, and just is producing a really rich discussion in the chat. I want to encourage everybody who's in the webinar, if you don't have the chat open, I want to encourage you to open it and read it as we go along, because we're getting great comments from participants, and we're also getting some comments from panelists in response. And so it is a really wonderful complement to what we're discussing in person, remote, rather than on the chat. The second just kind of housekeeping item I wanted to share is that we have been referring to the Administrative Cost Research report. That report is available online. It's a public report. The link to the report is in the chat. So you can either find it by Googling ACR report Humentum and it will come up, or you can find the link in the chat. And I believe Kathy also, thanks Jessica. Jessica just put the link in again. And Kathy also put the link in for Ford Foundation's evaluation. And so you can find that in the chat as well. And Jessica has just reposted that. Wonderful. So, I invite you to be able to see those documents firsthand and consult them after the webinar. So with that, I wanted to go back to Aidan. And Aidan, and actually you have been writing a bit in the chat about this already, but Twaweza, Twaweza was the main case study in the report. I invite everybody to look at the case study. It's great. And gives a good idea of what Twaweza has been doing in their approach. But, I think we're getting some questions, and it's come up several times about, we've talked about like a change of mindset. We've talked about what is required to actually go to a donor and say, no, the overhead rate that you are proposing to cover will not work for us. We need this. We need extra. We need money to put into our reserves. You have pretty successfully done that, but I know that you are an exception in the sector. And so could you share with us, do you have ideas about what it is that have made you all be successful in this way? What are some approaches that you may use that you've found to be successful? And what would you propose as guidance to others who may be on this webinar who are thinking about how do we actually do this within my organization.
Thank you very much, Christine. So I was fortunate enough when I joined Twaweza 7 years ago, in a few months, to have found already baked into this organization a particular approach to engaging with donors and partners, the funding partners for Twaweza. And that approach has at its core the idea that Twaweza really exists to do the program, to do the work out there, rather than to service the donors. Okay, so that's the first idea, which means therefore that we also have to think about how do we engage in a relationship that is also meaningful to the donors. So we then and now have been very intentional and very deliberate about crafting a strategy for Twaweza's work that is holistic, that is compelling, that is meaningful, that is hopefully impactful, that is daring, that is ambitious, okay? So we put together a strategy with a great theory of change, with a great set of problems that we're trying to address, with a really compelling set of approaches to try and address those problems. And we tell our funders, this is what we want to do for the next 5 years. Will you come on board? All of you together, collectively, jointly. We're not going to parse this out into projects. We're not going to pass it out into themes that resonate perhaps with your preferred approach. This whole thing comes as a complete package. Would you be willing to support the strategy? And over the 7 years I've been here, that approach has yielded about, I was looking at the numbers, about $45 million worth of funding since in the 7 years that I've been here. So one is you have one strategy, one way, one approach to addressing a multiplicity of really interconnected problems. And so you present to the donors a systemic approach to try to deal with systemic challenges, rather than putting it in silos and hoping that an approach here, an approach there will somehow additively, in an additive way, solve the bigger picture. So that's one. I think the second thing is also to socialize the funders into accepting one set of reports and accountabilities that they all see twice a year. We give them twice a year, that they all see, and they're all seeing exactly the same thing, the same budget, the same annual plan, the same audited reports. Everything is the same, and so they're all comfortable that that the picture that is being given to them by Twaweza is one and the same, fully transparent, and he doesn't have bespoke pictures for others. So then they trust the organization, because when they talk to each other, they're telling each other the same story. I think so. That's the second thing, and they're comfortable. The third is we invested, and again with funder support, we invested very heavily in very robust systems, in very robust sort of CRM, customer relationship management system, that allows us to do operationally our operational work, procurement, contracting, accounting very fast and in the cloud. We put our accounting system again in the cloud. We put our HR management systems again in there. So everybody sees, and it is all very nicely integrated. And it is easy, almost at the push of a button, to say, hey, donor X, this is what we're doing with everybody's money. And you can follow the track. So the systems themselves are very robust. And again, they have built a huge amount of trust from donors. Third or fourth, again, we're very transparent, and we find that not having to, so we don't have a problem of a funder, of two funders funding the same project, which I know is a fear, for many funders, especially the bilateral donors. So we don't have that problem because everybody funds everything, right? And everybody sees, therefore, everything. So when we are audited, when we are checked, when there's a due diligence being done by, say, a Danida, then a Sweden is comfortable with it, a Switzerland is comfortable with it, a Ford Foundation, Wellspring are also comfortable with that due diligence, because they know that we are being examined at the same thing. And I think the final thing, to your point, Christine, what advice would I give? And I started putting it in there. as grantees, I think have to expect more and demand better from the donors. We've had many negotiations, some of them are in the case study, where we say we understand that this is boilerplate conditionality in terms of, for example, you're needing to see our procurement policy or even giving us a no objection, but we actually told them we object to your ability to do a no objection for Twaweza. So we don't want you to have to no object when we are doing a procurement. You can audit us immediately after, you can comment on the quality, etc. But we don't want you in the kitchen when we're making the decision on procurement, because we trust our procurement policies. We have a track record of great audit outcomes. And so therefore, leave us the space and the flexibility to actually do the managing and stay out, politely, stay out of actually the running of the organization. So
and Aidan, I have to break in here because I bet there are other people on this call thinking, and what in the world is the reaction when you say that to a funder?
Well, I won't mention the funder, but we had a long conversation about that just last week, actually. And we arrived at a mutually agreeable component. They had some concerns about some of our procurement policies, not so much practices, but how come your practice isn't so encoded in policy? So when you encode it in policy, we'll be comfortable. But in order for us to arrive there, we also told them, fantastic, but please don't demand to come inside and do an objection to our procurement, even above a certain threshold, because we have policies. The mandate has come from the board to us directly, and you don't need to come in between. And, trust our governance system and trust that it is actually generating the kind of oversight that you require, on that. So they agree. But there are others, Christine, who say, we need you to report according to our template and according to our frequency. And we looked at it and we said, this is going to be so time consuming. It's going to be such a high transactions cost that we would actually rather not do it. And not only that, because we have already got 6, 7, 8, 9 partners who are comfortable with this approach that we're doing, if we bring you in with your own bespoke thing, then we have no leg to stand on in expecting the others to maintain that kind of more trust-based relationship with Twaweza. So in order to maintain this trust, we are going to turn down your $2 million. Thank you very much. And we will find it in other places.
Thank you. I think one of the things that I'm taking away from what you're saying is that, and we're all aware of this, the just incredibly broad spectrum of how funders are set up and how they flow that down or impose that onto their grantees. And that, and what I'm hearing you say is you have been able to identify a group of funders who, see what you're doing and want to fund it, but who are synergistic or aligned enough in the way that they work, that they can work together with you. And I would just guess that, for example, having a USAID cooperative agreement would mean you having to work in a very different way from how you might work with foundations, with your group of foundations or your group of other bilateral donors.
Absolutely.
And so you're saying that is a strategic decision that you are making to work with some and not with others.
But Christine, exactly. And the other thing is, we also propose to the funders a value proposition. I bet that our program officers, program managers, our partners inside the funding agencies have a very nice time with Twaweza. They don't have to constantly check up on us. We meet with them twice a year. We tell them, we share what we've done. They're confident about our systems. They're confident about our annual, our audited accounts. And so they have time, less, if they want to engage, less on the administrative side and much more on the intellectual content side of things. So that's the value proposition we also give to our donors and the program officers, that we are an easy client, we're an easy grantee from an administrative point of view. we are much more interesting to you from the content side, from the programmatic side, from what we're trying to achieve in terms of change. So you worry less about the administration and engage more about the actual work that we're doing.
Yeah, and if I may, what you're describing to me is what we are calling a meaningful partnership. It is not a transactional partnership, it is a meaningful partnership.
And I want to add one more thing. There is some, I think Frederic is his name. He made a comment further up and I was looking at that. And somebody else asked, do you have a resource mobilization strategy? And you know, those, they sound like they have content, but what we try to do, what I try to think of myself as, is of a steward of a relationship. I'm a midwife of a relationship between funders who are genuinely interested in the kind of systems change, the big questions that we're trying to grapple with, and us as the ones who are experimenting and implementing and learning and sharing these insights with the funders and with the rest of the world. So we are stewarding that relationship. It is not transactional. It is much more relational. And I think that's, it helps us out.
Great, thank you. I am going to switch gears just a little bit, but still very much on the same general area, and go to Kathy. And Kathy, I mean, obviously you're with Ford. You have described how Ford approaches this and how the BUILD program is approaching this. But could you tell us a little bit what you may be hearing from your peers at other foundations and possibly other bilateral or government or UN donors and funders? And how much do you think there is an openness to work in the way that Aidan has been describing? Do you see the general environment and atmosphere changing more towards this trust-based funding rather than the very patriarchal flow down colonistic, sorry, that is not a word, but you know what I mean, way of approaching this?
Thank you, Christine. It's a really good question. And I should also say I am trying my best to follow the chat, and the chat is out of control in the best way. There's no way I can keep up with it and also keep up with the panel at the same time. But please do keep those comments and questions coming because I think it's important that we all learn from each other. And I will go back and read it in full, I promise, after our time together is over. So I think there are different answers to your question, Christine, depending on the type of funder or donor you are talking about, right? So in the case of the bilaterals, I am not a bilateral funder. I have never worked for a bilateral agency. I do not want to pretend to be an expert there. But I will say that I understand some of their hesitation around unrestricted funding. After all, they are responsible to legislative bodies and ultimately to taxpayers in their countries. Their rules on government procurement and contracting, vary by country and are often not set by them, right? They're set by legislative or regulatory bodies. And so I can see why they would need to have more restrictions on their funding, more accountability on their funding. What I don't understand is why that translates into not paying any overhead. I think that if NGOs are able to demonstrate that in order to fulfill the terms of a cooperative agreement, for example, they need to have financial staff. They need to have monitoring, evaluation, and learning staff who can track all the data and write all of the reports that the donors are asking for. They need to have executive staff. They need to have a human resources department. These things are not negotiable. They all need to be in place and they all need to be paid for. And guess what? They all need to be paid for as part of the full cost of executing a project well. So that's the part where I really don't have a lot of sympathy or understanding for a bilateral agency that would come in and say, we're going to set your overhead rate at 15% or 7%, or even I've seen as low as 5% on some projects. That's just irrational. You cannot say that the work is going to cost this much and then only offer to pay for a specified percentage of that and expect the same results. It confounds human logic. In terms of private donors, because that's the world that I inhabit, again, I think there are differences in how ready they are to embrace more what we call trust-based practices. But we think about that as commitments to multi-year funding, to flexible and unrestricted funding, to really strengthening institutions for the long term by enabling investment in things like reserves, and to more equitable partnerships with those that we are funding. The way that Aidan just described it is beautiful and really the ideal as far as I am concerned. I will say that the COVID pandemic in the United States, at least, really accelerated these practices, and that among US funders, you now do have 60% of US funders saying, yes, they do want to expand their provision of general support, for example. I think that we are seeing less progress and less momentum out with funders outside the United States, funders in Europe, funders in Asia, especially, but also funders in Africa and Latin America. I think there is significant education work to do, both about why it is so important to provide funding equitably and in ways that account for the full costs of an organization's work. I think some of this is education, and I think some of this is helping those funders to see that whatever barriers or objections they are raising, whether they're questions around accountability, around impact, or just around sort of the mechanics of how you track and distribute money over time, that these are all barriers that other funders have found ways to overcome. And in a lot of cases, they're really not barriers at all. So I do think that a lot of work and potential remains for funders to shift their practices, regardless of where they're located in the world. I think Edge and Ariadne are doing some of that work, and many others are as well. I spend a lot of my time talking to other funders, deep one-on-one conversations. Here's how we did this. Here's how we did that. Here's how we set up multi-year budgets within the Ford Foundation. Here is how we track and monitor impact over time. Here is where we got over some of objections from our own staff about their feeling of a loss of control over resources, for example. And then I think there is an area we're not really talking about today, but I think it's a really important area, and it is the area of high net worth individual donors, who we are seeing again pop up all over the world. There has been a tremendous, as we all know, aggregation of wealth at the very top of our economy, not just in the United States, but in China, in India, in parts of Africa, in Europe. There is a disgusting amount of wealth being created, and a growing number of high net worth individuals who are prepared to give it away in ways that perhaps are profoundly different than before. I think Mackenzie Scott is the best example of this. I was very encouraged to see that her funding is now expanding internationally, and I'm very hopeful that we will see much more of that. And I am actively thinking about what we all might do as a sector to encourage more funders to follow her lead.
Thanks, Kathy. And just for those of you who may not know about Mackenzie Scott is a person who has great personal wealth, and she made the decision several years ago to give away her wealth, but at least started out by literally just kind of informing organizations that they were the recipients of 6-figure and 7-figure and 8-figure grants that in fact were no strings attached. Just basically giving those organizations money and saying, we trust you to know how to use your money best. And she has now gone through, I think, 3 or 4 funding cycles in this way. And as Kathy said, is now expanding how she works to global organizations around the globe, not just in the United States, which is where she started. So it is a new way of funding, and it is very much that trust-based philanthropy approach. And she has created a lot of ripples throughout the giving sector for high net worth individuals, and just this idea of, yes, we can actually give money to organizations because they usually know how to use it. They know what their priorities are. They know what is underfunded. So thanks, Kathy, for that. And let me go back to Tim. And Tim, can you talk to us a little bit about how this is resonating with you and thinking about what we at Humentum do, and this whole idea of, okay, it's great to think big and talk big. How do you actually take this and translate it into action? What are the things that are those key inflection points that we should be looking at creating action around to actually move the needle?
Thanks, Christine. Yeah, and I think what Kathy describes, and she was humble enough to say as well, that Ford still has work to do. So I think there's a big difference, and our first recommendation was consistently provide full cost coverage, or even consistently really implementing flexible funding. It's much easier to have a policy than it is to put that policy into practice, and that's because of the power dynamic, really fundamentally, that exists and probably will always exist to some extent, right, between the funder and the NGO. So how that shows up is that even if you've implemented a policy as a funder of providing full cost coverage, it's quite likely that the NGOs will be under asking unless the guidance being provided encourages them to ask for all of the costs to be covered. And I think there's been several chats, posts in the chat about how donor templates and that sort of thing don't even allow you to ask, right? So there's a difference about having guidance that really encourages full cost coverage, and CHAM was the architect of the Money Where It Counts protocol, which was an attempt to create a systematic way that could happen. So I think we need more systematic ways for that ask to be delivered by the NGO to the funder, so that full cost coverage can be provided to actually operationalize the policy. That's one point. And then when it comes to the core funding, that wasn't the main focus of the research, but because we got some data about some of the unrestricted agreements, what was really interesting, and I've witnessed this myself as a finance director previously, is just because the funder thinks they've given you unrestricted doesn't mean it's been applied as unrestricted. It's often we almost, and I've done this as a finance director, you use that money and you almost artificially restrict it yourself, and you don't necessarily use that money to strengthen your finance function or your organizational resilience or build reserves, and that's very human, right? It's very human to want to put the money first into the program rather than first into strengthening your organization. So I think there's a second piece of this about operationalizing, which is trying to take that balanced view on what does organizational resilience look like? How do you actually build that? And I think this is where, when we go back to that thing about expectations, we have to shift the whole mindset around what it means to be a non-profit. A non-profit it means that you don't distribute profits, right? But it shouldn't mean that you can't make surpluses, and that you shouldn't be using those surpluses in some cases to build your reserves. And so this is where with our work around the International Accounting Standard and all of this can start to change the whole way the non-profit sector is viewed, rather than it being like a sector that must spend everything that it receives every year on the work, rather than building a sustainable organization. And if we're looking at the kind of macro level, we need civil society and the civic sector in general to be more resilient, if it's to be more independent, if it's to be able to speak truth to power, if it's going to really be able to demand accountability both from governments and the private sector.
Great, thank you, Tim. Yeah, I've been listening to this and thinking about, again, kind of how successful are the INGOs within the sector at pushing back or at, saying, yes, we need our unrestricted reserves to grow as well. We need our costs to be covered. I have worked in several very large international NGOs and been shocked at how little unrestricted reserves they had on hand. But also been witness to them being very comfortable. I wouldn't say they like it, but being comfortable with the idea that they are eating up some of their reserves to be able to work with certain partners who will fund work that where administrative costs are not covered. I'm thinking specifically about the Global Fund, which is known throughout all of its partners as being very stingy on overhead and not meeting its costs. There is, within the US in particular, there is a well-organized, there are several well-organized advocacy platforms for US-based INGOs to come together and to discuss their common issues and challenges with various donors, and to go to those donors, and notably the US government, as a group and bring the weight of the group to those advocacy discussions. And for me, one of the clear missing pieces right now is that there is not a platform of that type operating to allow for local and national organizations who are now receiving more and more of this funding, or at least being targeted for the funding, whether it's getting to them or not is another issue, to be able to put collective weight behind the challenges that they are facing. And so I think that going forward, that is certainly an area that Humentum hopes to support. And we know that collective voice has power in ways that single voices may not. And so, again, reading the chat and looking at what people are saying in the chat, we have some examples of organizations being able to successfully push back, but I think it is also creating this collective movement around this that will help us actually, again, push the needle. Let me go to Aidan again and just check in with you about what you're hearing. I know you've been responding in the chat as well. What is coming out for you from this discussion, Aidan, that you would prioritize in terms of where we all as a group, as a collective, as a movement should be going in terms of trying to change the way that things work?
So let me really address myself to my colleagues in the NGO space who are on this call here. I think we need to rethink our role in this relationship and our contribution to the changes that we want to make. I think we need to go beyond or mature beyond a posturing as recipients of charity, which comes with all of the conditionalities that we've been discussing here, to one of a position of being a lot more propositional and a lot more confident about the assets that we bring to this partnership and this relationship between funders, NGOs, and frankly, government and business. I think we have a number of assets that we bring to the table. Number one, there is the whole passion for the mission that we want, to achieve. I think that should not be underestimated. I think number two, we have a huge amount of talent, although quite a bit of it, moves away, but there is a huge amount of talent that cuts its teeth in the nonprofit sector with new ideas, energy, approaches to trying to deal with these changes. Thirdly, I think we have a legitimacy with the constituency that others are looking for or others buy. Firms advertise to sell you a Coca-Cola or whatever it is, they buy your loyalty. I think civil society organizations have a legitimacy with constituencies, which is an asset. And finally, we have some ideas. You know, we've tried a few things, we've failed, we've learned, we've succeeded. We have some ideas that we can share. We need to recognize these 4 sets of assets that are put on the table and then package them compellingly for our funder partners, because do you know what? They also are looking for solutions. They don't come parachuting into a Tanzania or a Uganda or a Kenya with a solution. If they're honest, they don't know. And so you have context, you have relationships and networks, you have experience. That is value that you put on the table and say, this is how we partner together. And this is what you bring on the table as financial resources. We bring everything else, okay? Passion, networks, legitimacy, etc. And therefore, let us work together in a partnership. So for me, I think from a philosophical point of view, we need to see ourselves, NGOs, civil society organizations, with a propositional approach, with here are some solutions, here's some thinking, let us jointly invest in solving this problem. As long as we stay as vessels to receive funding, that is not going to change. That is not going to change the power dynamic. And this kind of change in power dynamic comes from believing and reviewing and rethinking ourselves from an internal and introspective place, not so much from a protest and picketing place, but from an internal re-evaluation and reconfiguration of what we bring to the table. And I think from there, you can have a different conversation with the funders, with the whether they're bilaterals or government or philanthropies. And I really want to underscore the fact that, at least in my experience, both governments and funders are actually hungry for solutions. They're hungry for new ideas to fund, to get behind, to get excited about. And yes, if we don't get to the table, we're not going to be able to make change.
I don't mean to interrupt, Aidan. I'm just so excited by what you are saying, because I think you are absolutely right. I think that, look, for far too long, funders have held the power because the perception is that money is power. Well, that's true. Money is power, but influence is also power. A strong base of committed constituents is power. Ideas are power. Solutions are power. Creativity is power. And NGOs have all of those things. In addition, we are in a moment of reckoning all over the world, reckoning with racism, reckoning with colonialism, reckoning with patriarchy, and funders are as lost in how to address these centuries-old challenges as everyone else. And we are hungry. Yeah, we are absolutely hungry for ideas, for solutions, for ways to repair and heal this broken planet before it is too late, right? So I would say that I think funders may be more open at this point to these types of conversations than we think they are. And I also think that just from a very cold power analysis perspective, funders actually need NGOs. At the end of the day, we write checks. And there is nothing we can actually accomplish with that money without giving it to a partner who has a vision for how to use it to better a community or a society or a planet. So for you to come to the table and know your own power and know that that funder actually cannot achieve their vision on poverty reduction or girls' education or climate mitigation or anything without you and what you bring, that is power. And if the funder is not willing to pay the full cost of a project, then what you should say to them is, look, if you still want to fund our work, then let's not talk about a project grant. Let's talk about what you can do as unrestricted funding and give us the money to use it creatively. We'll come back and tell you how it went.
And I wanted to jump in as well, and that one of the reasons why I think Aidan and Twaweza are such an inspiring case study is that they have convinced bilateral donors to walk this path. So I don't think we should worry if we kind of parcel the world into kind of philanthropic funders. I totally agree with you, Kathy. You do have more freedom, and you don't have the kind of the legislative bodies and taxpayers to report to, but governments have freedom too, the government funders, and USAID is currently really exploring what locally led might mean. And as part of that, they are going to have to reform some of the ways that funding is delivered to fully realize the potential, right? And to speak to some of the challenges that you've just presented, but it's not impossible for them to do that. And I think that the more that we kind of combine collectively, the philanthropic sector, the NGOs standing together to say, this is the change that we need to make to how funding mechanisms operate to fully realize the potential of what your funding is trying to achieve. And certain ways of managing risk and other things have started to throw so much sand in the wheels that it's getting in the way of achieving the potential that we absolutely need to realize right now.
Thanks, everybody. And sorry, the conversation just evolved in the way that I was actually going to steer it, because I could see that, Kathy was answering one thing on chat while Aidan was talking, and it was all lining up. I want to actually just put in a plug, and this is a shameless plug for Humentum, but we have committed to going forward working on operating models for equity, resilience, and accountability. And we look at this as a three-legged stool partnership. We have funders, we have international implementing partners, and we have local and national implementing partners, and everything is intertwined. We all need to be working on this. It is not just for one part of this equation to fix itself. It is for all of us to make changes to the way that we work, the way that we work together, and what we ask of the others in that equation. Humentum offers a whole lot of convening. We offer consulting and training and community, but I want to make a particular plug that we in the coming year are going to be building out a cohort, a working relationship with a cohort of local and national organizations in a way that we have not done in the past. And so I invite everybody on this webinar, if you are interested in continuing this conversation and being part of the work that we are taking forward, thinking about how do we provide platforms and resources and ways of working that may address some of the challenges and issues that we've been talking about today, please let us know. You can let Jessica know. You can send anybody, or not anybody, but Tim or me, Helen or Jessica, an email. And we would love to put your name on the list of folks who are interested in potentially taking part in this work. I will also say that we are very aware of the very long tradition of asking people for their time and effort and energy and not giving them anything in return. That will not be the case here. We are going to be thinking about how we make sure that those who engage in this process with us are also able to take advantage of the resources that Humentum provides, and that we are recognizing that you are putting your own time and effort into this. So, please have a think on that. If you know folks who would be interested in that, or if you yourself are interested, please let us know, or keep an eye out for the announcements that we will be making. With that, we have just about 10 minutes left. I want to make sure to hear parting words from all of our panelists. I want to again thank you, and I want to thank everybody who has said anything in the chat. Really, thank you for that. We will be making sure that the chat is made available after the webinar. The recording of the webinar will be made available. And as we've already said, the links to the reports are in the chat, and they will also be made available. So you can revisit this and you can share this as well. With that, I'm going to start with CM and ask you, CM, if you could give us just a minute or two of your thoughts about the importance of this work and really where you would like to see it going forward.
Thanks very much, Christine. It's been a really fascinating debate to listen to. I guess the remark that I'd like to leave people with links very strongly to the conversation that was just going on about the power dynamic and how you address the power dynamic. From a very practical perspective, I think that NGOs having a position and taking a position on their reserves, their financing strategy, their cost recovery policy, and having, I guess, a board approved position on that, a board approved policy, it won't eliminate the power imbalance, but it will go some way towards addressing the power imbalance, because it gives NGOs somewhere to stand in that negotiation with donors. It gives you somewhere solid to stand to allow you to push back to donors in the way that Aidan was describing. It shows donors that the NGOs thought about these things. It has a minimum position, that it can't really go beyond, and that it has a justification for why it's asking for the costs that it's asking for. It understands its own cost structure, and it can justify that cost structure. So I would really encourage every NGO that hasn't yet committed to a formal reserves policy and a formal cost recovery policy to commit to doing that work, and to making sure that they have the processes and systems to analyze their cost structures so that they can negotiate, justify, communicate, and push back. It won't completely address the power imbalance. Kathy's right, money is power, that is the truth of it. But I think it goes some way, and it gives the NGOs a solid standing ground, a solid point from which to say, you know what, no, we do ask you to go back to your HQ and ask for an exception. It just doesn't suit us. We can't do this work for 5% indirect cost rate. And I guess that would be my parting thought, having spent a good 18 months really reflecting on these issues with Humentum.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Siam. Tim, why don't I ask you next?
Yeah, I think I'll build on what Siam says, is that, I mean, you can rely on us from Humentum as we gain knowledge through research projects, and I want to extend my thanks to Ford and the other foundations that supported this research. We also want to democratize that knowledge. So as we develop, we're trying to use this research to develop tools around how to make it easier for organizations to develop reserves policies, cost recovery policies, etc. And so please stay tuned, because we'll try and create those as very accessible tools in the forms of self-assessments, guidance that can be applied by organizations. And please look out for that coming out from us in the weeks to come.
Thank you, Tim. Now I will ask for Kathy's final words on this. Final words for today. I'm sure there's much more to come.
Sure. So, Aidan inspired me to get all fiery and fight the power. And in reality, I am, quite an incrementalist myself. So I think that it is wonderful to hold a vision for a truly equitable partnership among donors and doers. And I think it is also can be very rewarding to just begin in whatever small ways you can. I think that Siam gives excellent advice about understanding your own costs of doing business and putting a reserve policy into place. Mm-hmm. I think Tim reminded me that there will be tools available to help nonprofits calculate their own indirect cost rates. These tools will be free and open source, and on Humentum's website, as well as on that Edge Ariadne Funders website. In the past, you used to have an accountant document your costs, and it was quite expensive to do that. This will make that much lower cost, if not free, and easy for any NGO to do. And then I would encourage you to pick the funder with whom you have the closest working relationship, the one that feels the least risky to you, and say to them, what would it take? What would it take to move us away from project funding to unrestricted funding? And if that is not possible for you, first of all, ask the funder, why is that not possible for you? But if they really say that is not possible, then say, okay, well, what can we do then to make sure the full costs of this project are covered? And how can I walk you through what my full costs actually are? I would start small and I would move on from there, because as we all know, small incremental change can add up to really big change over time.
Thank you, Kathy. Yeah, and I want to just underscore how important it is that we're hearing very practical things. But again, in the chat, people are pointing out, it can be daunting, it can be confusing to try to put one of these policies together. I can tell you just from Humentum, we just redid our restricted and unrestricted reserves policy, and that took us quite a few iterations. So don't be daunted by this, but I think a call to action for all of us in a position to do so is to think about how can we provide support, and perhaps people who have done this elsewhere to help with this, because it is not a small undertaking. With that, I'm going to go to Aidan. Aidan, you get the last word for this webinar, and then I'm just going to take it back to wrap it up and thank everybody. So Aidan, what is your parting thought for us?
Christine, thank you very much. You've made Troesa feel very special throughout the webinar, but it was such a great experience doing this work with you, Humentum. Before Humentum came along, actually Bridgespan did something similar, but I think at maybe less granular levels. So it's been fantastic. So let me leave with a couple of things. Number one, just a warning to my civil society and NGO partners. Let us not shift from being supplicants to being entitled, okay? So it's something in between. Let's not just beg the begging bowl, but then we shouldn't also be entitled, thinking, this is my right, you need to do it, because I think it will alienate too many people. Secondly, I think we should also recognize that what we're trying to deal with are big systemic complex problems, and that humility may be in short supply, and that I think maybe we should be a little bit humble about what we're trying to achieve. But that doesn't mean that we need to be timid about the ambition or the goal or the approach. Let's be humble that, we may not solve this, but let's be ambitious with what we're trying to do anyway, itself. So humility does not necessarily mean we need to be timid. But the final thing is, I'm going to come back to the title of the report. And the starvation cycle, as I was listening, really one of the starvation cycles that we hinted at, Kathy and I, is the starvation of ideas. And I think NGOs have a lot of ideas. We just don't think we do. We're so good at surviving, at fixing things on the fly, at innovating, but we don't understand necessarily the value that we're creating by doing that. So let's be more intentional about harvesting those ideas, be intentional about communicating, about articulating those ideas, and then sitting across from our funders, our donors, Kathy and others, and say, you know what, this is what we've learned, this is what we're trying out. Can you come on board with this? And I'm not saying it should be completely unstructured, whatever it is, but what my appeal is for us to recognize that we have this value to bring and put on the table. So we too can break the starvation cycle of ideas, while at the same time benefiting from breaking the starvation cycle of resources. And I think this makes for a fantastic symbiotic relationship.
Thank you so much, Aidan. I am going to add just one more thought to what you just said, which is you so well talked about, harvesting those ideas and being intentional about what those ideas are and how to share them. I'm going to say, for anybody who happens to be in a position to sit on the other side of the table when those ideas are presented, we all have a mandate to be intentional about listening to those ideas, and not just having our own fixed ideas in our head when we walk into a room and not changing them, even though somebody is bringing what they have really intentionally brought together to us. We need to be intentional listeners and intentional partners. And what I take away from this is that I've heard everybody talk about intentional partnership as a very key critical element to all of the aspects that we've mentioned on financial sustainability, unrestricted reserves, talking truth to power, all of that. So with that, again, thank you, everybody. This has been a great webinar. I always love to be in these webinars because there are so many interesting things discussed, and I think we are trying to push the needle and move us from thinking to action. And there's been a lot brought up today that I know will be fueling the way that all of us work going forward. So with that, thank you to our panelists, thank you to our participants, thank you to our sponsors. Please stay tuned because we will have more webinars like this coming up. We have one in July. And so if you are interested in particular in the topic of equitable and locally led development, please join us for our upcoming webinars and other opportunities to partner with Humentum. With that, thank you so much and have a good rest of your day and be well.